Welcome to the Crimson and Motive podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra. Join me as we explore the dark, twisted stories of murder, serial killers, and the demented. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today on my very first case of the Crimson and Motive podcast. And I am really excited to share this case with you. So, I'm going to be doing the sex slave murders. And I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. Now, this is a murder couple, and some reports say that they were just boyfriend and girlfriend. Others say that they were actually married. So I'm just going to be assuming that they were actually married because that is where I got the most information from, is that they were indeed married. Now, with this case, I find it super fascinating because it kind of has this nature versus nurture debate, and I'm going to be getting into that here nearing the end of this episode. It's just they both came from completely different families, and just how they both came together I find really fascinating. So let's dive into this, and I'm actually going to skip to the fourth instance of this murderous couple, and I'm going to take you to 1980 in Curry County, Oregon. It was June 7th, and Curry County is considered very much a tourist spot during this time. And with that, there comes a huge influx of crime, but not so much missing persons reports. That is until June 7th. Linda Aguilar, who is a local from Port Orford, was 21 years old, and according to family and friends, she was very friendly and outgoing. She had a significant other, and he was a commercial fisherman. And it was also reported that she was between 4 to 5 months pregnant. Now, this is where it gets sad for Linda. So she didn't own a vehicle. So how she got from place to place was through hitchhiking. And on this particular day, she was hitchhiking to Gold Beach for her scheduled doctor's appointment. But then she didn't return home. At first, the boyfriend thought maybe she was just visiting family or friends or out doing some errands. But as time went on, she still wasn't home. So he ended up going to the police, and the police ended up asking the community for help through radio, announcements, searching, and this actually worked. A local man ended up calling in and claimed he'd seen what looked like Aguilar on the side of the road, and she was approaching a possibly gold van that pulled over to let her in. Now, unfortunately, 2 weeks later, 2 German tourists were walking their dog near a very popular beach. And then the dog ended up being very interested in a particular spot in the sand. Upon further investigation, the dog was sniffing a human hip and a foot that was peeking out of the ground. Linda Aguilar ended up being identified as this body, and she was found buried in a shallow grave with her hands bound behind her back with nylon rope. Now, during the post-mortem examination, aside from the obvious sign of head trauma, sand was found in her lungs, which any true crime junkie knows, unfortunately, Linda Aguilar was buried alive. Now, the police looked at this rope and thought it was a very critical link, and this was due to how the knots were formed and the particular strand of this rope. This kind of rope was used for commercial fishing purposes, so automatically this puts the boyfriend, if not already, as the number one suspect. Now, after examining his boat and seeing that the equipment didn't match, he was ultimately cleared. So they ended up going back to the original man that called in, and he ended up going under hypnosis. And he ended up providing a little bit more information, which when you think about it, it's not the greatest. He did say that the driver was a man with dark complexion, and there was a smaller figure in the passenger seat, but he couldn't remember the license plate or anything like that. So ultimately, the case went cold, and people on the West Coast just went on their merry ways. A couple of months later, south of Oregon, in Sacramento, California, there was a 34-year-old bartender named Virginia Mochel. And like Linda, she was considered friendly and outgoing, according to her family and friends. And she loved spending time with her two children. That is until July 16th, 1980. She was locking up the bar at the local tavern that she worked at, and this was after closing time. But usually, she's not doing this alone. A few of the locals stick around to make sure that everything is fine and that she's okay. But this night was different. She actually ended up waving these people off, saying, "You know what, I'm absolutely fine. Don't worry about me. I will be okay." When she ends up getting to her vehicle, apparently there's a knock on the window, and that's all she wrote. No one heard from her again. When the police ended up investigating this as a missing persons case, her car was still found in the parking lot of the local tavern, and it was unlocked. When they ended up doing their investigation, they realized there were a few unfamiliar faces that night at the bar. And two of these people ended up being a couple from away. But they interviewed everybody and their story checked out, so they ended up moving on from the case. But all of this took a turn for the worst on October 2nd, 1980. Down near the Sacramento River, fishermen spotted the body of Virginia Mochel. Like Linda, her hands had been bound, but this time it was with fishing line. All of this was happening unbeknownst to the community, and everyone was carrying on as normal. A few months later, on November 1st, 1980, Mary Beth Sowers, age 21, and Craig Miller, age 22, who were engaged to be married and also university students at the Sacramento State University, were out celebrating with Craig's fraternity party at a local Sacramento restaurant. At around 1 a.m., they ended up leaving the restaurant and saying goodbye to their friends and headed towards the parking lot. Before they ended up reaching their vehicle, they were held at gunpoint and forced into the car. Craig's frat brother actually saw all of this unfolding and tried to stop, but then he stated that a female driver told him to back off. So he did, and the car sped off. The next day, he went to the police station and told them that he got a really good look at the perpetrators. And unlike other cases, he actually remembered the license plate. When they ended up examining Mary Beth's car, they noticed that the keys were still on the ground. And keep in mind, the car was left untouched at this local restaurant. When they ended up running the license plate of the car that the witness stated, it said that the car was registered to a 24-year-old Charlene Williams, or Charlene Gallegos. When they ended up going to Charlene's home, at first she denied everything. She claimed that she was with her boyfriend and they were in their car that night and they were nowhere near the restaurant. But the police were suspicious. They noticed that the car matched the one at the scene that the witness described. But it wasn't enough evidence, and the police ultimately decided that she wasn't involved, so they left. But later that night, a man and a young boy noticed something while walking on a rural road in Sacramento. It was a body, and it was later identified to be the body of Craig Miller. He was shot to death at point-blank range. They found 3 .25 caliber shell casings around the scene, and these matched the bullets found in Craig's head and neck. So, suspicions are running high, and they decided to go and re-interview Charlene, but they couldn't find her. But what ended up happening is the boyfriend's car was still parked in Charlene's driveway. So they ended up running the plates of this boyfriend's car and noted that it was registered to a Stephen Thale. Now, this is where things get super interesting. Stephen Thale was a person that was interviewed during Virginia Mochel's case. Not only that, but when they interviewed Charlene's parents, they said that Stephen Thale isn't his real name. It's a pseudonym, and his actual name is Gerald Gallegos. And here's another cool thing. They also told the police that Charlene and Gerald just sold a van similar to the one from Linda Aguilar's abduction. So, with the police, this means that these two people are linked to at least 3 cases. But unfortunately, during this time, they may have found Craig, but they were still looking for Mary Beth. But ultimately, on November 22nd, 1980, a young woman was found in rural Sacramento, and it ended up being identified as Mary Beth. Like Craig, she was shot point-blank range 3 times in the head, and there was evidence of being bound and sexually assaulted. So let's change gears here and talk about the Gallegos. So let's start first with Gerald Gallego. He was born in 1946. His mother was a Skid Row prostitute, and his father was sentenced to death in a Mississippi gas chamber. Gerald had 24 arrests by the time he was 30 years old, and this included incest, rape, robbery, and child abuse. He was married and divorced 7 times by the time he was 32. He ultimately married Charlene in 1977. They moved in together 1 week after meeting in a Sacramento poker club. Conversely, Charlene Gallego was a spoiled only child that came from the affluent Williams family. Her father was an executive for a supermarket chain. She was considered a violin prodigy and had an IQ of over 160. But although she was smart, she flunked out of junior college after 1 semester. She had 2 brief marriages in her 20s, and she was into drugs and kinky sex. So how did these two end up getting captured? Well, this definitely worked out for the cops, but definitely not for Charlene and Gerald. Now, the thing about coming from an affluent family and flunking out of junior college is you need to depend on your parents. So when they were on the run, they needed help, and Charlene's mother was providing them the money. So what the police ended up doing was convincing Charlene's mother to cooperate and help get them. So the first time Charlene called, she told her mom that they were in Nevada. But by the time the police got there, they found the car in Reno. But when they analyzed the car, they realized this was the same car used for the Miller-Sauer case. They ended up tracing them to Utah, but then lost them after locating them in Salt Lake City. But the police ended up getting a break. On November 16th, 1980, the fugitives were growing desperate. They were out of money. They didn't know who to trust. They didn't even trust each other at this point. So ultimately, Charlene ended up calling her mother and said that they were in Nebraska. Her mom begged her to turn herself in, but she still agreed that she was going to give them money at a specific location. But she ended up letting the police know where she was going to be sending that money to. So on November 17th, 1980, at 11 a.m. in Omaha, the police set up in strategic locations around the money transfer business, dressed in plain clothing. 20 minutes later, they spotted these suspects. Gerald stayed outside at a distance while Charlene went in. Then she was placed under arrest, and then they ended up capturing Gerald. When they searched the Gallegos' house, they discovered a box of .25 caliber bullets, but no murder weapon. They ultimately ended up getting a tip from a woman that worked with Gerald Gallego and saw him brandishing a gun to show off to scare a guy that was sleeping. They found bullets recovered in the ceiling of the bar he worked at, and it was a match for the Miller Sowers murder. Another cool thing about this case is they determined that there was a manufacturer error on the stamp of the bullets. The same error with the missing top half of the number 5 appeared on some of the bullets that Gallego possessed, as well as the ones from the crime scenes. When they ended up bringing the Gallegos in, they both accused each other of being the killer. Ultimately, the police would end up going with Charlene's story because she ended up confessing to more murders and her timeline added up. So before we get into the murders, she stated some things first, which brings us to why it was called the sex slave killers. So Gerald had a problem. He was impotent unless he received perverse pleasures. So what him and Charlene agreed to was that Gerald would bring home teenage runaways for threesomes so that way he could be sexually gratified. And sometimes Charlene would partake in lesbian adventures. They ended up agreeing to provide him disposable sex slaves. They ended up progressing to murder on September 11th, 1978. 17-year-old Rhonda Schleffer and 16-year-old Kippy Vaught were approached by Charlene at a Sacramento shopping mall. She ended up luring them with free marijuana. Once led, Gerald Gallego brandished a gun and drove to a remote area in Baxter. He then assaulted them, killed them, and disposed of their bodies. Both victims were found with a single shot to the back of their heads, execution style. The second instance took place on June 24th, 1979. 14-year-old Brenda Judd and 13-year-old Sandra Coley were abducted from the Washoe County Fair in Reno, Nevada. They were raped and beaten to death with either a hammer or a shovel, according to Charlene. Their remains were not identified until 20 years later, in February of 2000, when they were discovered 3 months prior in a shallow grave off the U.S. Highway 395 on November 30th, 1999. The third instance took place just a few months before Linda Aguilar, and this took place on April 24th, 1980. 17-year-old Stacey Ann Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs went missing from a Sacramento mall. They were discovered in July, sexually abused and bludgeoned to death along a riverbank. So Charlene knew at this point that she was facing the death penalty, and she decided to cooperate with the investigators and ultimately testified against Gerald. So in January 1982, both were tried for the Miller-Sauer killings. Charlene explained about the sex slave idea. They ended up purchasing a van, fitted it with a bed in the back, and they would hunt for their victims. So during trial, Gerald Gallego ended up dismissing his lawyers and represented himself. He felt confident that he could sway the jury to cast Charlene as the villain, but this did not work in his favor, and he was ultimately sentenced to death in June of 1983. Fearing that his sentence would be commuted, they ended up trying him in Nevada for the Twiggs Redican killings. But while he was awaiting trial, there was a chance that it wasn't going to happen. The Pershing County in Nevada was so impoverished that there was a chance that they were unable to afford the $60,000 to try him. When a Sacramento newspaper urged the public to donate, they ended up receiving over, get this, $20,000. And this included messages such as, "May the trial be swift and the noose tight," and another message that stated, "Please purchase 3 bullets and shoot that bastard Gerald Gallego 3 times." After this donation, there was enough money to have the trial, which had Gerald furious. The prosecutor, Richard Wagner, went on record to say, "I've never seen anything to equal his pure depravity or his lack of remorse." He was ultimately sentenced to death for the Twiggs Redican murder as well, but that was overturned in 1997. Now, here's the part where I get a little bit angry. So, for her cooperation and testifying against Gerald, Charlene was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months and was subsequently released in July 1997, completing her sentence. She has gone on record stating, "There were victims who died and victims who lived. It's taken me a hell of a long time to realize that I'm one of the ones who lived." She also went on record to state that she tried to save some of their lives. While in prison, she extensively studied psychology, business, and Icelandic literature. For Gerald Gallego, he ended up dying of cancer in 2002 while awaiting execution. So that is the sex slave murders. So I want to kind of take this time to talk about their MOs because I find it really fascinating. So with all of these cases, they ended up driving a van to either county fairgrounds. But here's the weird thing. Usually, serial killers try to enhance their killing techniques as each killing happens, but I find this to be all over the place. And, usually if someone requires some sort of perversion to combat sexual impotency, they would try to increase their their kill techniques. But this is all over the place. There's killing with blunt objects to being buried alive, then just execution style, which I think is either one of these two possibilities. Now bear with me. The first one, which I don't think is likely, the sexual gratification came from the victims being tied up. But even that's a stretch. When you kill someone with a gun, I would assume, because I haven't killed anybody, I would think that it's not as personal in comparison to other kinds of deaths. It's just very cold and calculated and not very intimate, for a lack of a better word. What I think is the second possibility. I think Charlene was more involved than what she let on to be. And I think that Gerald, got sexual pleasure from Charlene shooting the victims. It just seems like there's two different MOs happening together. I mean, like I said earlier, there's consistencies with each murder, but how they ultimately ended up murdering these poor souls is very back and forth and very wishy-washy. So I think personally Charlene was much more involved. But I completely understand where the police were coming from. If Charlene didn't cooperate with them, they might not have known about the first 3 murders. Now, here's another cool, interesting thing that I find, and that is this whole nature versus nurture. I think, now I'm speaking philosophically here, but I find it really interesting that these 2 people came from completely different backgrounds, and yet they both managed to come together and commit these heinous acts. So, for example, with Gerald, he had a very violent upbringing. And according to Dr. Harold Schechter, when someone lives in a constant state of psychological abuse, their views of the world are more malignant. They will seek to inflict torture as a means of revenge for their terrible childhood environments. In most extreme cases, they only feel alive when committing heinous acts, which, I mean, makes sense for Gerald due to his relationship with his prostitute mother and his death row father, and he only received sexual gratification from committing these awful acts. So, I mean, it really makes sense on the whole nurturing side of the debate, but what about nature? Now, conversely, I think Charlene makes a good case for the nature debate. That philosophical question, can someone be born inherently bad? I mean, she had the intellect and the IQ, and it would make her more calculated than Gerald. Gerald would be killing people out of passion. She would be thinking things out and planning, I would assume anyway. This is why I personally believe that she was possibly holding the gun. But in all reality, we may never know what actually happened. Did Charlene know the whole time that she would strike a significantly lesser deal if she flipped on Gerald? Was she more involved as an accomplice? Or was she a victim herself? I would love to know what you all think about this. So please send me an email at crimsonandmotive, that's AND, @gmail.com. So this concludes this episode of Crimson and Motive. Thank you so much for joining me today, and see you soon.